In a quiet middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, lives a small family consisting only of a father and his daughter. The father, Carlos Mendez, a middle-aged man, has dedicated his life to the well-being of his daughter since his wife died tragically in an accident when the little girl was still very young. Carlos, although reserved and somewhat strict, is a man who has earned the respect of his neighbors and friends, who always see him as a dedicated, hard-working and protective father. His daughter, Mariana, is his greatest pride, and he has tried to give her as stable and happy a life as possible, even in the absence of her mother. Mariana is a young woman who has just turned 19. Her presence in the neighborhood does not go unnoticed. Her beauty and natural charm attract the attention of everyone who meets her. She is cheerful, pleasant and kind, with an infectious smile that lights up any place she goes. Since she was little, Mariana has grown up under the love of her father and the respect of her neighbors, who see her as a young woman who, despite having lost her mother at an early age, has grown up in an environment full of love and values. Having just turned 19, Mariana is in that transition stage between adolescence and adulthood, exploring her independence and the world that opens up before her. The neighborhood where Mariana and Carlos live is quiet and familiar. It is a place where families usually know each other and take care of each other. The neighbors, for the most part, are hardworking and kind people who care about the well-being of the community. However, despite the tranquility that characterizes this place, there is one figure who generates mixed feelings among the inhabitants of the area. Police Officer Roberto Sanchez. Roberto is a 45-year-old man, with a long career in the local police force. He is an imposing figure, with a serious look and an apparently cold attitude that, on many occasions, intimidates residents. Roberto has gained a reputation in the neighborhood for being a rigorous man in his work, but his presence makes some of the residents uncomfortable, who perceive him as someone distant and difficult to read. Although not everyone in the community has a negative opinion of him, his character has led to few daring to approach and get to know him in depth. Despite the impression he makes on some neighbors, Roberto has been, for many years, one of the main guardians of neighborhood security. He is frequently seen patrolling the streets, making rounds in the vicinity and briefly chatting with some residents to make sure everything is in order. But behind that severe appearance, Roberto hides a lonely life full of personal frustrations, which has gradually affected his behavior and decisions. It was about a year ago, just when Mariana was about to turn 19, that Roberto began to pay her unusually special attention. At first, no one noticed this change in the officer's behavior, not even Mariana herself, who had always considered Roberto simply as the neighborhood cop. However, little by little, Roberto began to show more interest in crossing paths with her and striking up small conversations, taking advantage of any opportunity to interact. This attitude, which might seem insignificant to many, was actually the beginning of an obsession that would quickly grow within him. Roberto, who had never had a stable relationship and had not been emotionally involved with anyone for years, began to see in Mariana a kind of ideal, a pure, joyful, and full of life young woman, the complete opposite of the loneliness and bitterness he experienced in his own existence. At first, he tried to justify his thoughts, telling himself that he only wanted to protect her, that he was only looking out for a young neighbor whom he had seen grow up and whom he wanted to keep out of trouble in the neighborhood. But over time, those thoughts began to transform into something darker and more disturbing. Roberto's obsession with Mariana grew to such an extent that, every time he saw her, he experienced a mix of emotions that were difficult to control. His mind began to create fantasies in which he was someone special to her, someone Mariana trusted and admired. For him, Mariana represented a kind of escape from his monotonous and empty life, a hope of feeling alive again. However, that hope was based on an unhealthy desire, on an obsession that would only bring devastating consequences for all involved. With each passing day, Roberto looked for excuses to meet Mariana. It was no longer just about surveillance rounds in the neighborhood, but a carefully planned strategy to have at least a moment of contact with her. When he saw her leaving her house, he found a reason to approach her, either to ask her how she was or to make some comment about the safety of the neighborhood. He even went so far as to wait, during her rounds, at strategic points where he knew she would pass on her way back from work or college. Mariana, for her part, noticed Roberto's constant presence, but at first she didn't give it much importance. Since she was a child, she had seen Roberto as an authority figure in the neighborhood and, although she was a little surprised that he was now so interested in talking to her, she attributed it to the mere courtesy of a kind neighbor. However, as the months went by, she began to feel uncomfortable with the intensity of his attention, although she never imagined how far the policeman's thoughts went. Carlos, Mariana's father, didn't suspect anything at first either. He trusted in the safety of his neighborhood and, Although he was always alert to any possible danger for his daughter, he would never have imagined that one of the guardians of local security could represent a threat. For Carlos, Roberto's presence in the neighborhood was simply part of everyday life, a guarantee that everything was under control. However, the tranquility of this small family was about to crumble, dragged down by the sick obsession that grew every day in Roberto's mind. Roberto, increasingly consumed by his obsession, began to develop thoughts and desires that broke any moral boundaries. It was no longer just admiration or a genuine interest in protecting a young neighbor. Roberto began to idealize Mariana in a toxic way, imagining her as his, a kind of personal trophy that would give meaning to his life. In his mind, he convinced himself that he was in love with her and that, in some way, she reciprocated his feelings, although Mariana never showed any interest in that sense. However, this hidden desire would soon become a dangerous reality, when Roberto, unable to control his impulses, would begin to look for ways to seduce Mariana and win her over. In his mind, he had already decided that he would do whatever it took to make her see him as something more than just a policeman. His obsession was such that any obstacle, even Mariana's resistance or the possible disapproval of her father, would not represent a break for him. As Roberto became more obsessed with Mariana, he began to plan their encounters more precisely. Over time, these casual encounters were no longer innocent. Roberto began to make small gestures, such as subtle compliments and prolonged glances that gradually began to make Mariana feel uncomfortable. She still did not suspect the real danger posed by the policeman's interest, but she could not help but feel that his presence was becoming more and more suffocating. Roberto became increasingly brazen in his attempt to gain Mariana's trust. He began sending her messages on social media under the pretext of making sure she was okay or giving her safety tips in case she ever found herself alone. At first, Mariana appreciated the gesture, thinking it was a kindness from the police officer. However, over time, the messages became more frequent and increasingly personal in tone. The messages were no longer just safety tips. Roberto began asking for personal details, how her day had been, if she was feeling lonely at home, and if she needed him to accompany her somewhere. Mariana, bewildered, responded politely but with some caution, trying to keep her distance without being rude. However, each response she gave only fueled Roberto's obsession, who interpreted that politeness as a sign of interest. In her mind, Roberto had completely distorted reality. Every smile Mariana gave him, every kind gesture, every cordial word was, to him, an invitation, a sign that she also had feelings for him. He was convinced that if he insisted enough, he would get Mariana to understand his feelings and eventually give in to his advances. This overflowing self-confidence and inability to see the damage he was causing led him to plan how to make his wishes come true. Roberto began to appear in places where he knew Mariana would be. When she left work, after finishing her classes at the university, or even when she was shopping in nearby stores. The young woman began to notice that the policeman appeared more frequently than usual in her daily life. Although she tried to ignore him, uneasiness began to grow inside her. Something told her that Roberto's attention was not normal, but she hesitated to tell her father, fearing that Carlos would react violently or hastily. Carlos, for his part, was focused on his work and on giving the best to his daughter. Although he couldn't help but worry about her, especially now that she had come of age and was becoming more independent, he trusted that Mariana would know how to take care of herself and make good decisions. Carlos didn't suspect for a moment the reality of what was happening, because in his eyes, Mariana was a capable young woman with a judgment to keep any uncomfortable situation at bay. But Roberto's behavior didn't stop. He then decided to take it a step further, organizing chance encounters, in which he would, coincidentally, appear in the same places she frequented. At first, these encounters seemed accidental, but over time Mariana began to realize that it was always him who crossed her path, always the same policeman with a disturbing smile and an increasingly penetrating gaze. As the weeks went by, Roberto finally managed to start a conversation with her in a park near his house. He took the opportunity to talk to her about his life, his work in the police, and how he felt committed to the safety of his community. His tone was soft, almost paternal, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made Mariana uncomfortable. Although Roberto tried to show a protective and kind face, his words and physical closeness began to cross a line that was becoming more and more obvious to the young woman. Mariana, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, began to avoid certain places and times so as not to meet him. But Roberto, in his obsession, interpreted this as a game of hard to reach, believing that she was resisting so that he would insist even more. This only intensified his attempts to get closer to her, seeing in each refusal an opportunity to redouble his efforts. Mariana had no idea how far Roberto's obsession would go or the dangerous implications it would bring for her and her father. Finally, one day, Carlos began to notice that Mariana was behaving in an unusual way. He noticed that she was a little withdrawn, as if something was bothering her. However, when she asked if everything was okay, Mariana would simply smile and tell her that she was just tired. She didn't want to worry her father or make him think that there was something he needed to worry about. But inside her, the uneasiness grew more and more, as Roberto continued to approach her with intentions that were more and more obvious and difficult to ignore. Carlos remained confident in the safety of the neighborhood and did not imagine that, behind the policeman's appearance of protection, there was an obsession that would put the tranquility of his home at risk. Roberto, blinded by his attraction to Mariana and fueled by the loneliness and bitterness of his life, would soon take his desire to a level of imminent danger, which would change the lives of Mariana and Carlos forever. Roberto's obsession grew by leaps and bounds, and with each passing day, his thoughts about Mariana became more invasive and difficult to control. Her image not only filled his thoughts, but began to affect his daily life and his work performance. His desire for her had become a fixed idea, a need that tormented him and drove him to find a way to get closer to her, to win her over. Roberto, aware of the age difference and Mariana's inexperience, knew he had to act with caution. He couldn't risk making sudden or overly obvious moves that would scare the young woman. So he opted for a calculated strategy, using emotional manipulation to gain her trust. He began to show himself more vulnerable in his conversations with her, talking about his loneliness and the difficulties of his personal life. This, in his mind, would create a special connection, a kind of compassion that Mariana could interpret as emotional closeness. Every time they met, Roberto tried to show her his more human side, talking about the sacrifices he made in his job as a police officer and how he too felt alone in the world. These feigned confessions managed to awaken in Mariana a feeling of empathy towards him, because the young woman, despite her discomfort, began to see Roberto as someone who also deserved compassion. Little by little, Mariana found herself in a difficult situation. Although something in her told her that she should keep her distance, at the same time, she could not help but feel a certain pity towards the police officer, who showed himself to be a broken person in need of company. Over time, Mariana began to let her guard down, and Roberto took every opportunity to get closer. One afternoon, as she was walking home from college, Roberto intercepted her and offered to take her in his car, under the excuse that it was safer for her. At first, Mariana hesitated, but ended up accepting, believing that she had nothing to fear. During the ride, Roberto was even bolder. He confessed that he deeply admired her and that he felt a special connection with her, as if fate had brought them together in the same neighborhood for some reason. Mariana felt confused, because although Roberto spoke softly and without being explicit, it was clear that his words had a different tone, almost romantic. The discomfort was evident on his face, and Roberto realized that he needed to be even more persuasive. He decided then to soften his words, telling her not to worry, that he only wanted to protect her and that he would be there for whatever she needed. This, instead of reassuring Mariana, aroused a mixture of confusing feelings, because although something told her that she should not trust, she also could not imagine a police officer acting inappropriately. Weeks passed, and Roberto continued to get closer and closer, always being gentle and protective, although his gaze and gestures were beginning to be more evident. Until one day, in one of their casual encounters, he dared to go further. On that occasion, he managed to persuade Mariana to accompany him to a quiet place on the outskirts of the neighborhood, under the pretext of wanting to talk in private, away from prying eyes. Once there, Roberto, unable to control his obsession any longer, decided to confess his feelings openly, telling her that he loved her and that he couldn't stop thinking about her. Mariana was stunned. Roberto's words left her paralyzed, unable to react. The declaration was so unexpected that, for a moment, she didn't know what to say. However, Roberto, seeing her confusion, took the opportunity to get even closer and gently take her hand. Mariana, bewildered and caught in a mix of fear and compassion, did not know how to react, and it was at that moment that Roberto decided to kiss her. At first, Mariana tried to pull away, but her inexperience and the emotional pressure that Roberto had put on her made her hesitate. In her mind, she began to question whether perhaps she had misinterpreted the situation, whether perhaps Roberto's feelings were genuine. Doubt and confusion led her to give in, allowing the kiss to continue, not knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of a secret relationship that would bring devastating consequences. Roberto, seeing that Mariana did not resist, interpreted this as a sign of acceptance and, convinced that she shared his feelings, began to seek more and more private encounters. Mariana, caught in a mix of contradictory emotions and under the manipulative influence of Roberto, ended up giving in to his advances. The relationship between them quickly intensified, and what began as a casual encounter transformed into a secret and increasingly intense relationship. Over the next few weeks, Roberto and Mariana began seeing each other in remote places in the neighborhood, where they could be alone without raising suspicion. The relationship became physical, and Roberto, unable to contain his desires, began to take advantage of every moment alone with Mariana to satisfy his obsession. For him, having Mariana in his arms was the culmination of a sick dream he had nurtured for months. But for Mariana, each encounter plunged her into an internal conflict, a feeling of guilt and confusion that grew with each new encounter. Despite everything, Mariana decided to remain silent, unable to understand the gravity of the situation she was trapped in. She felt that if she spoke to anyone, she could unleash a scandal or even ruin the reputation of her father, who trusted in the safety of his neighborhood and the integrity of the members of the police force. So, instead of seeking help, she remained silent, bearing the emotional burden of a relationship that was increasingly suffocating her. However, Carlos began to notice changes in his daughter's behavior. Mariana, who had always been cheerful and open, now seemed more reserved and distracted. In addition, she had started leaving the house more often and spending more time outside than usual. Carlos, worried, tried to talk to her, but Mariana was evasive, assuring him that everything was fine. However, Carlos's uneasiness did not disappear, and he began to suspect that something strange was happening. One night, while going through some things at home, Carlos found a message on Mariana's phone from an unknown number. Upon reading the message, he discovered that it was from Roberto, who spoke to him in a loving and possessive tone, something that left Carlos stunned. Fury and desperation took hold of him, and he immediately realized that his daughter was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a police officer. Carlos confronted Mariana, who, feeling trapped, had no choice but to confess the truth. Through tears and shame, she explained how Roberto had manipulated her and how she had fallen into his trap without knowing how to escape. Carlos, devastated and enraged, felt betrayed and humiliated, not only by the police officer he had trusted, but also by the fact that his daughter had become involved in a relationship that he would never have allowed. Carlos's resentment towards Roberto grew exponentially. Not only did he feel cheated, but he also believed that his role as a father had been violated and trampled on by the officer. In his mind, a dark thought began to form. The only way to protect his daughter and avenge the broken trust was to eliminate Roberto from their lives. Carlos began to devise a plan, one that, although risky, would allow him to restore peace to his daughter and cleanse his family's honor. Roberto's unhealthy obsession and the manipulation he subjected Mariana to had reached a point of no return. For Carlos, the discovery of this forbidden relationship was a devastating blow, which not only shattered his trust in the people in his neighborhood, but also filled him with uncontrollable rage. In his mind, Roberto was nothing more than a predator who had taken advantage of his position of authority to seduce his daughter and make her part of a relationship she had never really wanted. The fury and sense of betrayal turned into a fixed idea: to protect Mariana, even if it meant taking justice into his own hands. Carlos spent the next few days immersed in dark thoughts, meticulously planning how to carry out his revenge without raising suspicion. He didn't want anyone to suspect him or his family. He wanted everything to look like an accident, something unexpected that no one could relate to him. For days, he studied Roberto's habits, remembering every detail about his routines and habits. Finally, he decided that the best way to carry out his plan would be during a dinner at his own home. It would be the perfect place, where he could have total control and the freedom to execute each step without interruptions. Carlos came up with a complex and carefully crafted plan. First, he approached Roberto and invited him to a dinner at his house, with the excuse that he wanted to talk about what was going on and make sure there were no hard feelings. Carlos knew that Roberto, in his arrogance and confidence, would see this as an opportunity to consolidate his power and control the situation. Without hesitation, Roberto accepted the invitation, believing that Carlos was willing to accept the relationship and that he had somehow earned the right to be together with Mariana without opposition. The night of the dinner, Carlos prepared everything with precision. Mariana, ignorant of her father's true motives, helped organize the table, not suspecting that this evening would become the scene of a tragedy. Carlos maintained an eerie calm, knowing that every move was calculated to carry out his plan without fail. When Roberto arrived, Carlos greeted him with a cordiality that perfectly concealed his true feelings. He invited him to sit at the table, offering him a glass of wine and engaging in casual conversation while they waited for the food to be ready. As the night progressed, Carlos slipped Roberto's drink a sedative he had obtained days before. He knew he had to be careful with the dosage, so that Roberto wouldn't notice anything unusual and could continue the conversation without suspicion. The drink slowly began to take effect, and Roberto, although still conscious, began to feel strange, more relaxed and less alert than usual. Carlos continued the conversation, leading it towards more personal and deeper topics, playing with Roberto's emotions, until the policeman completely let his guard down. Finally, when the time came, Carlos asked Mariana to go up to his room, telling her that he wanted to have a man-to-man conversation with Roberto. The young woman, confused and somewhat nervous, obeyed without knowing that, by leaving the room, she was leaving her father free to execute the final step of his plan. Carlos, taking advantage of Roberto's vulnerability, approached slowly, staring him straight in the eyes. At that moment, all the emotions repressed for days of hatred, resentment and pain exploded in a single, devastating action. Carlos attacked Roberto with the fury of a father who has been betrayed, using a knife that he had hidden in the table for the crucial moment. The fight was brief, as the sedative had left Roberto without the strength to defend himself. As blood stained the floor of the room, Carlos felt a strange mix of relief and horror. She had avenged her family's honor and eliminated the person who had destroyed the peace of her home, but at the same time, she knew that she had crossed a line from which she could never return. Mariana, hearing noises from her room, ran down the stairs, encountering the scene that would change her life forever. Seeing her father covered in blood and Roberto's lifeless body on the floor, she felt invaded by a mixture of terror and despair. The young woman could not believe what she was seeing. Her mind tried to process the impossible, trying to find an explanation that would make it all not real. Through tears, Mariana screamed, demanding an explanation that Carlos, trembling, tried to give her. He told her that he had done everything to protect her, so that Roberto could never hurt her again. However, Mariana, in a state of shock, was unable to understand or accept her father's reasons. For her, what had happened was an irreparable tragedy, an indelible mark that would destroy her family forever. In her desperation, Mariana made the decision to go to the police. Without saying another word to her father, she left the house and went straight to the nearest station, where she sobbed and recounted what had happened. The officers, baffled by her testimony, were quick to rush to the Mendez home, where they found Carlos, who offered no resistance and surrendered without protest. He knew his fate was sealed and that he had taken a path of no return. The trial was swift and devastating. The evidence was clear, and Carlos' confession left no doubt about his guilt. During the trial, details of the relationship between Roberto and Mariana were revealed. Although the court was sympathetic to the young woman, who was seen as a victim of the policeman's manipulation, Carlos, for his part, was tried for premeditated murder, and the court, after analyzing all the elements of the case, sentenced him to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Mariana was devastated. She had lost her father, the only close family member she had left, and all because of a forced love, a relationship she had never wanted and that had brought destruction to her life. The young woman spent months trying to rebuild her life, but the trauma was deep and difficult to overcome. She knew that the life she had known would never be the same again, and that the memory of that night would haunt her forever. Carlos, locked in a cell, spent his days in silence, immersed in a mixture of regret and resignation. Although he had acted with the intention of protecting his daughter, he understood that his revenge had not brought him peace, but had destroyed the only thing he truly loved in life. The walls of his cell were now witnesses to his remorse, to the long hours in which he remembered the happy moments with Mariana and wondered if there was another way to solve everything without reaching that tragic outcome. The neighborhood, once quiet and familiar, was forever marked by the events that shook the community. The neighbors, shocked by the story, shared mixed feelings. Some believed that Roberto had gotten what he deserved, while others lamented the tragedy that had ruined the lives of Carlos and his daughter. However, they all agreed on one thing: the Mendez family would never be the same again.